History doesn't repeat, but power keeps recycling the same tricks. And the oldest trick is simple. Don't just own the thing. Own the way the thing moves, because when you control movement, you control prices, timelines, and even what people are allowed to imagine as possible. So today, we're not talking about a single country, or a single leader, or a single war. We're talking about the global supply chain, a roughly $7 trillion flow machine that everybody depends on, but nobody truly commands from top to bottom. Stay with me. And if you're into money and history stories where the boring systems turn out to be the real weapons, subscribe now. You'll start seeing the same pattern behind every shortage headline, every tariff drama, and every unexpected delay. Because once you realize flow is power, you stop asking, who's loudest, and start asking, who decides the schedule? That's the difference between watching the news and understanding the machine. Empires don't rise through armies first, they rise by controlling movement, trade, resources, money. Because the first real power is deciding what can move, how fast, and at what cost. Rome didn't become Rome just by winning battles, it became Rome by turning roads into an advantage. So supplies and legions moved like clockwork while enemies were still guessing where the threat would land. Britain didn't rule the world by occupying every square mile. It ruled the seas, it set the shipping tempo, and once you set the tempo, everyone else starts paying you in one form or another. Now look at the Soviet system. People argue about ideology all day, but the practical core was energy and production. Who got fuel, who got steel, who got rail capacity, who got priority, who had to wait. If you can decide who waits, you can decide who grows. It's not flashy, but it's brutal. Here's the part people miss: control of flow isn't just infrastructure. It's leverage. It's the difference between a rival being strong and a rival being late. And in history, being late is often the same as being dead. Modern power works the same way, just with different tools. Today, it's not only roads and fleets, it's ports, container schedules, shipping insurance, trade finance, payment rails, standards, and the quiet paperwork that can say yes or no without firing a shot. Think about a single container. It's a metal box, right? But that box is wrapped in permissions. A carrier needs a slot. A port needs capacity. Customs needs documents. Insurers need a route they're willing to cover. Banks need the invoice to look clean. Compliance teams need the buyer to pass a screen. And if one layer says no, the box becomes a statue. So when people say, trade is free, I'm going to be blunt. It doesn't feel free to the people moving it. It feels like a checklist. And whoever influences the checklist influences the world. And the checklist has owners, even if they don't look like emperors. Shipping alliances decide schedules. Port operators decide queues. Customs agencies decide what gets inspected. Insurers decide which routes are normal and which routes are too risky. Banks decide whose paperwork counts as trustworthy. Standards bodies decide what even qualifies as acceptable. Here's a small example that tells you everything. A container can be packed, sealed, and ready. But if the bill of lading doesn't match the letter of credit, the bank can pause payment. If payment pauses, the seller pauses shipment. If shipment pauses, the buyer pauses production. No missiles, no speeches, just a mismatch in a document. You can see the modern choke points like scars on the map. Narrow canals, crowded straits, a handful of megaports, and the financial rails that settle most trade in dollars. None of that is an accident. Systems naturally concentrate, because concentration is efficient and efficiency is seductive. But remember what empires learn too late. What's efficient is also fragile. So yes, armies matter. But before the army, there's a road. Before the road, there's supply. Before supply, there's the permission to move. And that leads to a simple question that sounds almost childish until you realize it's deadly serious. If flow is the foundation of power, who controls flow today? And who only thinks they do? And here's the uncomfortable twist. In a system this big, the power is often spread out, not centralized. No single actor runs the whole thing. That sounds safe, but it isn't, because when power is spread out, responsibility is spread out too. When something breaks, everyone shrugs and says, "Not my part." Meanwhile, the flow still stops. So the global supply chain becomes a shared dependence. Companies rely on it, governments rely on it, banks rely on it, consumers rely on it, but the system itself doesn't care who's yelling. It only cares whether the gates open, and because it's shared, it's easy to underestimate. You don't feel the chain when it's smooth, you only feel it when it tightens. It's like water pressure, invisible until the tap runs weak. That's why the most powerful moves in modern trade are often quiet. A rule change that adds 2 days at a border, a new screening list that slows approvals, an insurance tweak that raises premiums on a route, a bank policy that refuses certain documents. 2 days doesn't sound like empire stuff until you realize 2 days can kill a product launch, freeze a factory schedule, and trap millions in cash. Control of flow is still the first form of power. It just wears a suit now. As empires expand, their systems become larger, faster, and more complex, and that feels like strength while it's working. Bigger networks, tighter schedules, and the confidence that this is how the world is now. But what looks like dominance is often just growing dependence on smooth flow because the whole machine starts needing perfect timing to stay alive. A small delay turns into a chain reaction. The bigger the system gets, the more damage a single disruption can cause. And that's when growth stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like a trap. Here's why. Growth doesn't just add more. Growth links more. When an empire expands trade, it also expands dependencies. A city relies on grain arriving on time. A factory relies on parts arriving on time. A retailer relies on inventory arriving on time. A bank relies on payments arriving on time. The moment everything relies on on-time time becomes power, and when on-time becomes power, everyone starts chasing the same dream, remove slack, lean. But lean has a hidden price. You don't notice the risk while the system is calm, you only notice it when the calm ends, so the empire builds a machine that feels unstoppable, until one day the machine meets reality. A port backs up, a canal closes, a war shifts routes, a pandemic shuts a cluster, a single supplier fails. It doesn't have to be dramatic, it just has to be enough to break the timing. And then something ugly happens, the empire starts paying for speed with money, and paying for money with stability. If a shipment is late, cash is stuck. If cash is stuck, companies borrow. If companies borrow, interest costs rise. If interest costs rise, prices go up. And when prices go up, politicians panic. Then policies change. Then policies create more uncertainty. Then uncertainty creates more delays. See the loop. It feeds itself, and the loop doesn't need a headline to start. Sometimes it starts with a missing part. A tiny piece that's so cheap nobody talks about it. A sensor, a valve, a specific chemical, a chip, a certain grade of steel. Then one factory somewhere can't ship it, and suddenly 5 industries discover they were all leaning on the same invisible pillar. That's why the supply chain can feel like it breaks. Even when most factories are still open, the chain doesn't fail as a whole. It fails at the pinch points. Not gonna lie, this is the part that makes modern systems feel haunted. You don't need a villain. You just need a tight network and a few shocks. The system does the rest, and this is why the biggest empires often look strongest right before they start wobbling. Because the same expansion that made them powerful also made them dependent on smoothness. And smoothness is not guaranteed, so growth feels like power until it becomes a trap. The empire gets big enough that it can't slow down without hurting itself. It can't adapt without breaking contracts. It can't change routes without rewriting the whole map of dependencies it built. And notice the reversal. It doesn't get fragile because it's weak. It gets fragile because it's optimized. The very thing that made it look advanced is what makes it sensitive. That's why collapse can start in the middle of success. If you've ever seen a giant company act terrified over a small delay, that's why, Big systems don't fear small problems. They fear small problems becoming proof that the system isn't smooth anymore. That's the trap. You grow into a machine you can't easily rewire. Every empire believes efficiency is strength, and once that belief hardens, it starts treating speed like safety. So it removes buffers, cuts redundancy, and assumes stability will last. Because after a long winning streak, stability starts feeling normal instead of temporary. And that makes the system look strong right up to the moment it breaks, because a system without slack isn't strong, it's just quiet. Let's talk like grown-ups about what optimization actually means. It means you pick one best path and bet your future on it. You consolidate suppliers, you centralize production, you tighten inventory, you rely on a few meganodes, you assume your shipping lanes stay open, you assume financing stays cheap, you assume insurance stays available, you assume the rules stay predictable. That's a lot of assumptions. And here's the trick. Optimization feels smart because it works, until it doesn't. The success of the system becomes the evidence that the system will keep succeeding. That's how people get addicted to it. Then, a shock hits, and the empire discovers the difference between efficient and resilient. Efficient means you waste less in calm times. Resilient means you survive noisy times. History is noisy. So, when an empire removes buffers, it's not just saving money, it's selling its future options for short-term performance. And options are everything in a crisis. Think of redundancy, like oxygen. In a good day, oxygen is invisible. You don't thank it, you don't budget for it, you just breathe, but remove it, and suddenly nothing else matters. That's what happens when you cut redundancy. The system becomes impressive, and then it becomes brittle. And here's the trick. Brittleness hides behind good times. When ships arrive on schedule and credit is cheap, people laugh at the idea of extra inventory. They call it waste. They call it old-fashioned. They push everyone to go faster. Then, the day comes when everyone wants the same thing at the same time. Certainty. And certainty is the one thing an optimized system can't manufacture on demand. The brittleness shows up in small ways at first. One delayed component, one missed delivery window, one factory that can't run because one tiny part isn't there. The empire starts adding fees, adding rules, adding inspections, adding layers of risk management, and each layer adds friction. So, to fix fragility, the empire often makes itself slower. That's the cruel irony. The tighter you build the machine, the more painful any shock becomes, and the more desperate you get to control it, and the more control adds friction. So, the same optimization mistake repeats every time, different era, same pattern. They think cutting slack proves strength, but slack is what keeps you alive when the world stops cooperating. That's why you're hearing a new idea everywhere, even if people hide it behind nicer language. Just in time is fading, and just in case is coming back. Not because executives suddenly got sentimental, but because they got burned. One missing component shut down a line. One blocked route turned into weeks of chaos. One surprise policy turned a normal shipment into a stranded asset. And once you've been burned, you stop asking, what's the cheapest path? You start asking, what's the path that still works when things get weird? That's a different mindset. It creates different maps, different contracts, and different alliances. If this is clicking, subscribe now, because the next episode breaks down the money layer behind the boxes, the part most people never see, but the part that decides who gets oxygen when the system tightens. Empires don't collapse because enemies attack first. They collapse because their systems stop adapting, and the world changes while the empire keeps repeating yesterday's playbook. Trade routes, supply chains, and financial networks become too specialized to replace quickly. So when one link fails, the empire can't swap it out. It can only wait, and waiting feels like weakness. Control quietly turns into dependence, and dependence turns into panic, because panic is what you feel when you realize you can't replace the thing you built your life around. This is the moment where power becomes a cage, and the cage doesn't look like prison bars. It looks like commitments, long-term contracts, specialized ports, single-source suppliers. A fleet built for one route. A financial system tuned for one kind of risk. A bureaucracy trained to repeat the same process. When the environment changes, those commitments stop being assets and start being anchors. At the peak, the empire thinks it's in control. It has the biggest network, the deepest financing, the most sophisticated logistics, the most connected economy. It feels like a win, but then the environment changes, new technologies shift routes, rival coalitions form, conflicts change insurance terms, sanctions change who can pay whom, rules tighten, standards shift. Suddenly, the empire's control turns into dependence on the very network it built, and dependence shows up as pressure, not headlines. Procurement teams start adding just-in-case inventory. Banks start tightening trade credit. Insurers start excluding routes. Companies start rewriting contracts. Ports start prioritizing certain flows. Governments start demanding screenings and audits. Nobody calls it collapse. They call it caution. They call it safety. They call it policy. But the feeling inside the system is the same. It's getting harder to keep things moving, and then people start reacting. Not in one coordinated plan, but in self-protection. Everyone tries to reduce exposure at the same time. And when everyone protects themselves at the same time, the system clogs. The empire can still move goods, but it can't move them smoothly, and smoothness was the real source of its power, so control turns into dependence. The empire becomes trapped by its own pathways. It can't unwind without pain. It can't rewire without cost, and because it can't adapt quickly, it starts losing the one advantage it relied on: speed. Here's the dark detail. When dependence turns into panic, leaders often respond by tightening control even more. More rules, more screenings, more restrictions, more pressure on choke points, and that can feel like strength, but it often makes the machine even less flexible. So the empire keeps trying to force a system that needs adaptation. That's how control becomes dependence, and dependence becomes panic. And if you want the simplest warning sign, it's this. When powerful actors start talking less about growth and more about security, screening, and risk, they're telling you the system is tightening. Tightening is not always collapse, but it is always stress. From the inside, collapse feels like delays, shortages, tighter rules, and rising costs, and for a long time it still feels fixable, because nobody wants to admit the system itself is the problem. Rome saw longer supply lines and slower deliveries. Britain saw trade dominance slipping and sea control getting more expensive. The Soviet system saw rigidity, shortages, and a structure that couldn't adjust without breaking itself. To outsiders, it looks sudden, but the pattern is always slow, silent, and familiar, because collapse is usually just the day the denial finally runs out. Let me say it in plain language. Collapse is paperwork before it's fireworks, and collapse is also psychology before it's economics. People don't panic at once. They adjust, then adjust again, then pretend the adjustment is normal. A company adds temporary surcharges, a port adds temporary screening, a bank adds temporary checks, a government adds temporary controls. Then a year passes and the temporary stuff is just life. It's the little signs that pile up: the extra week, the higher fee, the new inspection, the stricter standard, the temporary rule that becomes permanent, the supplier that quietly stops taking new orders, the bank that quietly reduces your credit line, the insurer that quietly changes terms. Inside the system, people rationalize it. It's just a busy season. It's just politics. It's just inflation. It's just uncertainty. And then, one day the system reaches a point where every actor is cautious at the same time, and the machine slows down enough that everyone can feel it. To outsiders, it looks like a sudden fall. To insiders, it feels like a long, slow squeeze. And if you're paying attention today, you can feel echoes of that squeeze in modern trade. Choke points matter more than ever. Rules are tightening, costs are jumpier, companies are shortening supply chains not because they love change, but because they're tired of being surprised. Governments are fighting over standards and subsidies and security because flow has become a weapon again, and you can spot it in plain sight if you know what to look for. You see priority lanes, you see trusted shipper programs, you see more auditing, you see more documentation, you see companies paying for warehouse space they swore they'd never need again. You see longer contracts turning into shorter commitments. You see firms building the same part in two places, not because it's cheaper, but because it lets them sleep at night. So the big picture is not the world stops trading. The big picture is that the world stops trusting the old setup to stay smooth. That's why production reorganizes into regions. That's why companies build backups. That's why finance becomes stricter. That's why insurance becomes expensive. And that's why the same winners keep showing up. Not always the ones who build the most, but the ones who control the gates, the routes, the standards, the financing, the insurance, the permissions. Now here's your hook for the next episode, because this is where it gets real. The supply chain is not only containers, the supply chain is also money, and money has its own choke point settlement systems, bank compliance, credit lines, and the quiet power of saying approved or denied. And when that permission layer tightens, the whole world feels it without knowing why. Prices jump, and people blame greed. Shelves go thin, and people blame mismanagement. Companies miss targets, and they blame the market. But behind all of it is the same mechanical truth. The chain is not only physical, it is financial, it is legal, it is political. So if you want to understand who has leverage in the next shock, don't only ask who makes the product, ask who can slow the product down, ask who can refuse coverage, ask who can tighten credit, ask who can add 2 days of checks. The power is often the ability to say no, while everyone else is forced to say yes. So tell me in the comments, what do you think is the biggest hidden gate in the modern world? A canal, a port, an energy route, a payment rail, or something else people aren't even watching? And one more question, because it matters. If you were running $1 billion business, would you bet everything on the cheapest route? Or would you pay more just to avoid the next surprise? Be honest, that answer is where the future is heading. If you want the next breakdown, the one where we track a single shipment step by step and show where the money layer squeezes it, where the insurance layer prices it, and where the bank layer approves. Hit subscribe, because once you see how the permission layer works, you'll stop asking, why is this happening? And start asking the only question that matters. Who benefits when flow gets tight? See you in the next one. Until then, watch the gates. That's where the story always starts.